Greetings from Mesa United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
And the gospel reading, Luke 24, 1 through 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners, and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Charlie was a standout football player in his small town in Missouri when he was growing up. And not only did he excel on the athletic field, but he excelled in the classroom as well and was accepted to the United States Naval Academy, where he ended up graduating near the top of his class. After graduation, he became an officer in the Marine Corps and served on the front line in the first Gulf War. We need to stop having wars that have sequels to them. And while he was in Iraq, Charlie was awarded several decorations for valor and his leadership, and he came back to his small town as a hero. Everyone was proud of their hometown boy. Everyone wanted their son to grow up and be like Charlie. But as happens with many soldiers, Charlie came home with memories and things that weren't dealt with properly, and he began spiraling downward into mental illness, began committing violent crimes, which ended him up in jail, where his mental illness went left untreated, and it became worse. He lost an extraordinary amount of weight. He chewed off the tips of some of his fingers and one day gouged out his own eye, and then was incarcerated into the psychiatric units. But every week, Charlie's parents, Bill and Barb, went to visit Charlie. Sometimes they brought their pastor, United Methodist pastor by the name of Reverend Scott Krostek, with them. Charlie was no longer that great athlete, that great student that everyone talked about. Now everybody, if they talked about him at all, only talked about how far he had fallen, about the crimes that he had committed. He was no longer that boy that people wanted their sons to emulate. After serving several years in prison, he was released to a halfway house near his parents' home, and he began coming to church with them on Sunday. And then he asked the pastor if he could begin serving as an usher. And Reverend Krostek said that he got scared when Charlie asked him that question, because he wondered how people would respond. How would they feel about seeing Charlie serving in this role? Would they be able to see past his history of crime, be able to see past the fact that he was missing an eye and some of his fingertips? Would they be able to see past this idea of who they thought Charlie had become? But Reverend Krostek said yes, and so the next week Charlie was there to start handing out bulletins And Reverend Krostek said he was still afraid of what might happen, how people were going to respond when they started coming in the doors. But the first few people smiled and took their bulletins. And then as more people saw him, they said, "Hey, Charlie, good to see you. How you doing?" And Charlie thrived in his role as usher. He began putting on weight. He went out and got nicer clothing. He cut his hair. And he started enrolling in a local college to take some classes. Today, Charlie, with the help of his parents, owns 34 acres outside of the town where he raises sheep. And he invites people to come out to help him shear sheep, and he invites the school out so they can talk about how to take the wool and make it into yarn and how yarn is used in everyday activities. Charlie's a shepherd. And his goal now is to try and pass on some of the love that was gathered to him in his church, who they no longer saw him as that ex-con, as somebody who has mental illness, but saw him as a beloved child of God. That, says Reverend Krostek, is a resurrection story. But Reverend Krostek also wonders what would have happened if he had responded differently when Charlie asked if he could be an usher. What would have happened if the congregation would have responded differently when they saw Charlie being an usher? What if they couldn't get past their fears of who Charlie was? What if he couldn't get past his fears of Charlie and wouldn't allow him to be an usher? If they had responded differently, if he had responded differently, Reverend Krostek says it would not have been a resurrection story at all. Today we come to celebrate the best known resurrection story, when the women went to the tomb all those many years ago, and when they got there the tomb was empty, that Jesus had been raised from the dead. It's the one day of the year in which we celebrate new starts and new lives and new beginnings, and it directly intersects with our desire to consume as much chocolate as we possibly can. But as we think about resurrection and Easter, do we think about Charlie's stories or other Charlies in the world as being part of that? Is that the resurrection we conceive of when we think about Easter? Is it about new beginnings and new life, or is it just about that one moment in time with Jesus? Because I think part of the problem we have with Easter is that we already know how the story ends. Even when we gather on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, we know what is to come. We know that Easter is right around the corner. We know that when the women get there, that they're not going to find Jesus in the tomb. There's no longer any suspense for us. It'd be like if we knew who was going to win the World Series in October, before the series begins. Would we watch the rest of the season? Would it make any difference? Most people would say no. I'd still watch it, but most people would say no. Because we know what's going to happen. We already know the outcome, and so we miss all the other storylines that are taking place underneath it. But the women who went to the tomb all those many years ago did not expect to find what they found, or didn't expect to find what they didn't find, which was Jesus' body being there. They had no idea that that's what was going to happen. They had spent the past 2 days in mourning, in waiting. They had gathered together the spices to go and prepare Jesus' body for burial, because there wasn't enough time from when he was taken off the cross to when he was put in the tomb. And so they've been waiting for 2 days. And everybody who's been in mourning knows that those first few days after the death, you're just disconnected from the world. You're just going through the motions, putting one step in front of the other, just doing the tasks that have to be done. And you're sort of amazed that the rest of the world hasn't stopped along with you. You're like, why don't you feel the same thing we do? How could you keep going on about your ordinary lives when this has taken place? And so you just go through the motions, and you know that if you didn't go through the motions, you'd just be a lump crying in the corner. But in their shock and dismay, then the women go to the tomb to prepare the body to do proper mourning over Jesus. And in that sense of mourning, they've lost some crucial pieces of information. And so the angels have to remind them of what it is that's taken place. Because when the women get there, surprise to them, not to us, surprise to them, the tomb is empty. And so the angels say, "Why are you looking for the living amongst the dead?" Well, when the girls come to me, and my daughters come to me and they say, "I've lost something, can you help me find it?" I say, "Where's the last place you saw it?" Right? So it's not a surprise that the women went to the tomb, because that's the last place they saw Jesus. That's where they expect him to be. So it makes sense that that's where they are. And the angels say, "No, you can't be looking for the living among the dead. That's not where he belongs." But when we're looking for resurrection, when we're looking for new life, when we're looking for new beginnings, are we looking in the wrong places? Where are we looking for new life? Just like the old song says, we're looking for love in all the wrong places. I think we look for the resurrection in all the wrong places too. We look for the living amongst the dead. But those things are not about the resurrection. We even look for it in chocolate bunnies and marshmallow peeps, but it's not found there either. And it's not found in troubled relationships or difficult situations, and it's not found even in the valley of the shadow of death. And resurrection is not found there because that's not where new life and new beginnings are. And yet at the same time it is there, because you can only have resurrection after death. Just like you can only have rainbows after the rainstorm. So they're found there, but you can't look for it there if you expect to find it, because you can't find the living amongst the dead. We have to look outside of our current situation, to look to something new, a new way of life, a new way of being, to find that resurrection, because that's where resurrections come from. If Charlie or Reverend Prostek had only looked in the current reality of the situation, the resurrection would have never been found. They had to look beyond that to see something new, to allow that resurrection story to happen. But there's one other key point that the women forgot. And the angel says, "Why are you looking for the living amongst the dead?" And he says, "He's not here, he's been raised. Remember what he told you when you were in Galilee, that he must go and be crucified and on the third day be raised from the dead." Remember when he said that? Now the women forgot. They got caught up in their sorrow, so disconnected from their own lives and their own story, they forgot what Jesus had said. Now it's possible that they didn't believe that Jesus meant that when he said it originally. That's probably the case. But when they got to the tomb, they might have said, "Well, he's not here. Oh, remember when Jesus said that to us?" Maybe that's what happened, but they didn't remember. We need to be reminded about the resurrection, because we too forget. We know what comes at the end of the story, so we don't get surprised every year. We know what happens. But when we are in the midst of turmoil and suffering and mourning, we don't know what the outcome is yet for us, and we don't make the connection of the Easter story to our own lives. We get separated from it. We forget that Easter tells us that God didn't just redeem and resurrect Christ, but that God promised that same story to us as well. And we normally think that, well, it's just about the end of life, that when we die, we'll gain eternal life because of the resurrection. But what Paul tells us in his letter to the Romans is that God can make all things good for those who love Christ. That resurrections are possible, that hope is possible, not sometime in the far distant future when we die, that it happens right here and right now, because Christ is with us, and Easter is always with us. But to make that a reality in our lives, we have to start looking for the living that happens outside of the situation that we are in, to look for life outside of death. We have to remember what was promised to us. And the third thing we have to remember is that resurrections take time. If we were to have someone come and visit us who never heard of seasons, say an alien comes down to visit the planet, and he comes in the middle of winter, and everything looks like it's dead, and there's brown grass and brown trees and no leaves, and there's no flowers, and nothing is growing, and you talked about spring, and you said, well, it's just right around the corner, and pretty soon there'll be leaves on the trees and flowers and green grass. Would they believe that that's going to happen? Not likely, because it doesn't match the reality. Everything around them is brown and dead. They couldn't see the new reality, first because they'd never experienced it, and we can't see it because we don't remember what has happened. Because it doesn't happen immediately, we think the resurrection is never coming. But Jesus is raised on the third day, not the first day, not the second day. I'm not even sure the women and the disciples could have handled that. They were so stuck in their mourning and what had just happened, the shock of that experience, they couldn't even comprehend it. They had a hard enough time on the third day, let alone trying to comprehend earlier than that. Resurrections take time to happen. But eventually the third day always comes. Because resurrection is possible, even and most importantly, in death. So what that means is that we have to plant a seed in expectation of new life. That's what we do in winter or going into the fall, is we plant new seeds to prepare for new life. It takes a while for them to grow. But you can't just plant it and then expect the best things to happen. You have to tend it and water it, even if it's the water of your own tears. If you just put it in the ground and hope for the best, you might get something on the other side. But you really need to tend that seed. Saying, I believe that new life is going to come from this. That even in the midst of everything else that's going on, new life is there. But we also have to deal with the reality of the situation in which we live. Not to make more of it, but not to make less of it either. To see it as it is. The women, when they go to the tomb, and they don't find Jesus there, they don't believe that he's not dead. They don't say, oh, he must have been faking. Or maybe he was only a little dead. He wasn't all the way dead yet. They know he's dead. What they want to know is, where'd the body go? They know what the reality of the situation is. There's something known as the Stockdale paradox, named after Admiral James Stockdale, who was the highest-ranking military official in the prisoner of war camp in Vietnam, known as the Hanoi Hilton. And when he was asked about what his experience was and how he got through his years there, he said that he never lost faith in knowing the end of the story. That he knew that the story would end with him getting out and that he would prevail in the end. You might say that's the Easter story. He never forgot what the end of the story was going to be. And so then he was asked, well, who had the hardest time in prison? And he said it was the optimists. And that's why it's a paradox. You might think that the optimists have the easiest time. They always have the positive outlook. But he said the optimists would say, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and go, and they'd still be there. We're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and go, and they're still there. We're going to be out by Thanksgiving. And pretty soon you're back to Christmas again. And he said they would die of a broken heart. So then the interviewer said, well, what did you do then to get through this? And he said, this is the important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose. Never confuse the faith that you will prevail in the end with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be. Don't confuse knowing the end of the story with changing your current reality. Knowing the end of the story, that resurrection is possible, And that hope is possible drives you through realizing that you can make it through your current reality. So I take that to mean don't look for the living amongst the dead. You have to look for it outside of that situation. To realize the situation that you're in, but also to know that hope and resurrection are possible in that situation. The women went to the tomb to find Jesus because that's where he had been. They recognized the situation they were in. But then they were told, remember what Jesus had told you. Remember that the third day will always come. That resurrections take a while, but new life is possible. New realities are possible. A new future is possible. Not as some idealistic pipe dream. That's what the optimist wanted. But a new reality is possible because what Easter means for us is that not just that Jesus was resurrected, but the resurrection and new life and new beginnings are here for us too. What God did in turning death into life and crucifixion into resurrection and mourning into celebration, God does for us as well. Because just as the women encounter the risen Christ, we too are called to encounter the risen Christ. Because the Gospels found our faith not in the story that the stone was rolled away and the linens were folded all nice and neat on the bench. The Gospels ground our faith in the presence of the risen Christ in human experience. It's not the pervasive power of the empty tomb. It's a pervasive power that Christ is present for us. A living reality that leads to our faith. Seeing that the third day has indeed come, that resurrection is not just a possibility, the resurrection is a reality. Jesus said he came to give us not life, but life abundance. Which means we have to look for life amongst the living. That if we are in the midst of pain and suffering and mourning, to remember that Easter moment. To remember what Admiral Stockdale and the angels and Jesus tell us. To know how the story ends. Not just Jesus' story, but how our story ends. It ends with new life and new possibilities with resurrection. Because God has promised us love and forgiveness and mercy. God has promised us hope in the midst of despair. God has promised us new life. Sometimes it seems like it takes forever to get there. But the third day always comes. We know the end of the story. It ends not with death. It ends with life. It ends not with mourning, it ends with celebration. So I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters. Amen.